1788. France, then a leading world power, spent half its annual budget just on debt interest. 50%. Imagine if Emmanuel Macron said tomorrow that half the French budget would go just to paying loan interest instead of funding the country's needs. That's exactly what happened to Louis XVI. And this terrifying figure is the result of 800 years of a very French tradition, the art of royal bankruptcy. Before France became known for human rights, it was, in a way, a nation of bankrupt kings. But how did Europe's richest, most powerful monarchy invent the art of never paying its debts and manage to do it for centuries without being wiped off the map by its enemies? Well, that's the incredible story we're going to discover today. At first, in the Capetian monarchy, royal financing is simple in its logic. The king is simply the leading noble, and his income mainly comes from seigneurial rights. These include types of rents his subjects paid and resources he drew from his personal domains. This was also true for the other nobles then. But when war comes, it's a different story. That's when the feudal system comes into play. The king summons both his direct vassals and their vassals. His vassals arm themselves at their own cost when summoned, at his disposal for 40 days, with their pages and their knights. Here, the king has limited resources, but his needs are also small. There are no regular taxes or levies, except for special contributions required from townspeople or the church during crises. But, as you can guess, this system has its limits. So what happens when the king's ambitions grow? Well, that's when the first debts of the kingdom appear. Royal debts are starting to show. With King St. Louis, royal authority is strengthened, as well as French interventionism outside the kingdom. King St. Louis has great ambitions. During his reign, he launched 2 crusades and collected precious but costly relics attributed to Jesus Christ, for which he also had the sumptuous Sainte-Chapelle built in Paris. But how can a king with limited income fund major military campaigns, build grand monuments, and buy coveted sacred relics at the same time? Well, that's where a player you might not necessarily expect comes in. The Italian cities. Yes, it was mainly the great families of Venice and Florence who founded the modern public debt system. But why did the Italian cities develop this system? Well, it was a response to the needs that Italian leaders had to finance their wars, which were waged with the help of expensive mercenary companies. So it was the wealthy Italian merchant families, with their great fortunes, who set up sprawling banking networks, first expanding in Italy, then to all of Europe. From then on, war became the main cause of deficits in royal accounts. It's expensive, and lords, princes, and sovereigns spend large sums defending their interests or conquering new lands. But when these methods are no longer enough, the kings of France have to get at least a little creative. Royal finances faced several difficulties before the modern era. The tax system remained underdeveloped for a long time, causing accounting disorder, as historian Michel Lutfala notes. In contrast, the growth of produced wealth is very weak, and this remains the case until the Industrial Revolution. The French economy grows just 1% per year, lacking both a dynamic economy and an efficient tax system. King France necessarily has to raise funds elsewhere in order to carry out his projects. How do the kings manage? There have been 3 main ways to address this. The debt could, in the best case, simply be amortized and thus gradually repaid. But what was more common, however, when the royal treasury faced difficulties, was to consolidate the debt. That is, to repay it over a longer period at a lower rate in the hope of eventually enabling its repayment. But there is a final option that unfortunately was just as often used, which simply consisted of not repaying it. And to do this, 2 main methods were used. The first is the least subtle, and simply consisted of not paying anything anymore and stopping debt repayment. To do this, the king still needed a legal veneer and had to have the support of the Parliament of Paris, which at the time acted as a kind of court of justice. The king could thus, with the agreement of the Parliament, repudiate his debt and declare bankruptcy. Historians call the second, more creative method a sneaky repudiation. It simply consisted of minting money in order to pay back all or part of the debt. However, this generated inflation, which means a loss of the value of money and, as a result, a general impoverishment of the population. In this context, a king emerges who will transform the art of avoiding debt repayment. Philippe for the Fair, grandson of King St. Louis of France, inherits large debts, yet must fund a costly war against the Flemish. So what to do? He isn't one for subtlety. He forces wealthy bourgeois to lend him money, seizes Italian and Jewish bankers' assets, devalues the currency, and raises taxes. But his most famous victim is still the Order of the Temple. This religious and military order, known for its exploits in the Holy Land, is also prosperous and owns many estates in France, while the king clashes with the Pope, who oversees the Order of the Temple. They also made the mistake of lending money to the crown, thus trying to solve several problems. The king suddenly arrested the Templars on October 13, 1307. Accused of heresy and tortured, they saw their wealth confiscated by the crown, which was later only partially returned to the Hospitaller Knights. The Capetian monarchy, while showing that it intends to follow its own political interests and no longer behave as a vassal of the church, settled part of its debt in the midst of this turmoil. Unfortunately, his successors are inspired by these various methods. Afterward, the credit system persists and grows in importance, while forced loans, like those under Philippe le Bel, continue. The French kings then resorted to loans to finance the conflicts that marked the 100 Years' War. The king's advisors and top financial officials were directly involved in the credit system. Before being replaced by major Italian merchant bankers after the war, these individuals even held top positions in French royal finance. With Francois I, modern public debt began, as efforts were made to avoid harshly exploiting bondholders. He thus created the first perpetual loan in 1522, which basically consisted of paying a creditor an annuity in exchange for a sum that was lent. This amount is never repaid, and the king owes nothing. Technically, there's no interest, but the annuity acts as interest in practice. This subtlety is explained for religious reasons, as Catholicism had forbidden usury, or lending with interest, so this rule is bypassed in this way. France's unstable politics and international issues later caused the kingdom's finances to collapse, resulting in several bankruptcies. Henri II, son of Francois I and King of France, borrowed heavily for the Italian wars until 1559. Afterward, he just doesn't pay what he owes. Following the expensive religious wars, Henri IV and Sully lowered some interest rates and defaulted on some loans. In this case, they take advantage of the breathing room given to them. These accounting maneuvers helped reform the economy and later achieve balanced accounts. A few years later, during the 30 Years' War, Mazarin, who was the main minister of the kingdom from 1642 to 1661, borrowed at very high interest rates. As a result, royal revenues simply can no longer keep up, and he simply ends up suspending the payment of the annuities associated with certain loans. He again forcibly takes and partially defaults on the debt while also sharply raising taxes. This then contributes to the outbreak of the Fronde in 1648, which is essentially a civil war that will devastate France for several years. Louis XIV, traumatized as a child by this period, became uncompromising as a ruler. If any king perfected the tradition of spoliation and bankruptcy, it was Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis XIV perfectly embodies the French royal principle. He thinks big, he spends a lot, but he tends to leave the bill to others. But the result, at least financially, is no less predictable. There are many currency devaluations, and in just a few years, the currency of the time loses a third of its value. But that's not enough, and in 1710, his minister Desmarais is forced to declare partial bankruptcy. He cancels all the kingdom's annuities with a single pen stroke. But worse is coming. Louis XIV's successors will turn this mismanagement into a national disaster. That's how Louis XV stays on this path, even after the disastrous 7 Years' War. Abbé Terray, the final controller general of finances under Louis XV, persuades the king to cancel some debt, dispossessing the kingdom's creditors. But his successor, Louis XVI, still tries to improve. He abandons Louis XIV's methods and works to restore the kingdom's credibility by upholding its financial commitments. The intention is good, but the American War erases it. In fact, this war, from which France emerges victorious, is a real financial abyss. Financed 91% by debt, France is indeed victorious, but at what cost? Well, it's exorbitant. In 1788, it's a financial apocalypse. The debt represents 80% of the national wealth, while 50% of the state budget is swallowed up by interest on the debt. France falls into a debt spiral, borrowing just to pay interest on earlier loans. Briefly, the King of France loses control and seeks help from his subjects. That year, storms ruin French crops, and with soaring debt, Louis XVI convenes the Estates General. But the representatives of the Third Estate do not forgive 150 years of poor financial management and demand fairer tax reforms. You know what happens next. It's the French Revolution. The revolutionaries inherit the monarchy's debts and must find a way to repay them. Their initial solution is to produce assignats, which are banknotes backed by the property of the clergy. When war begins in 1792, expenses surge, and the French government prints increasing amounts of money. Assignats soon become worth less than their production cost. The disastrous financial legacy, national chaos, and mismanaged public accounts led to the bankruptcy of two-thirds in September 1797. Only a third of the public debt is repaid, while the rest is canceled, depriving many small French creditors. The bankruptcy is then almost total. This greatly pleases the government, as it mostly erases the monarchy's and revolution's debts. So what can we take away from this incredible French financial epic? In France, bankruptcy was common. French kings borrowed heavily and rarely repaid. The country's leaders have always found reasons for debt, mainly war, but also lavish buildings and unrest. But when they could no longer pay what they owed, well, the French leaders found many ways to make others pay. It was always either their creditors, the population, or often both, who had to foot the bill. The parallel with events in France is clear. With over 3,000 billion euros in debt, political instability, and decades of ineffective financial management, one can only wonder if this old French tradition is now just history. And that's exactly what I suggest you watch in the documentary that's now showing on the screen.